When I first glance at a horoscope, my attention goes not only to the sun and the moon, but most particularly to the aspects that they make. And I wouldn't even begin to try to interpret what the sun in any particular zodiac sign meant, unless I thought about what was aspecting the sun, and also the house position. But today we're talking about aspects. Like, for example, if somebody, I have Sun conjunct Mars, square Pluto. My Sun's in Taurus. And a friend of mine has a Sun opposition Neptune. And Neptune is conjunct the Moon. We're very, very different in how we express our Sun in Taurus qualities. There's more grounds for saying we're quite different than we are similar. And this is because of the aspects made to the sun. So I'm trying to emphasize the importance of aspects as a moderating influence over any particular planet. So if a planet is aspected by another planet, the operation of that planet is significantly moderated, very significantly. When we're considering aspects, we have to consider what it is. What is an aspect? And briefly speaking, we're talking about an angle between two planets. The angle of 0 would be a conjunction. 60 degrees would be a sextile, 120 a trine. 45 would be a semi-square, 90 a square, 120 an opposition. 30 semi-sextile, 150 a quincunx. There are others, the quintile set, the septile set. The circle can be divided by 9 and other numbers which are popular. The Navamsha chart in Hindu astrology is the study of the 40 degrees that arises when you divide by 9. So each of these aspects brings a different quality of relationship, and they're called soft or hard typically. The soft ones, conjunctions mostly, sextiles and trines. The hard ones, semi-squares and squares, oppositions, and quincunxes. The operation of these changes the interaction of the two planets. So if you have a Sun trine Jupiter, it would be an easy flowing energy. But Sun square Jupiter would bring about some introduce a frictional aspect to their combined interaction. And an opposition would do the same thing, but it'd be a little bit more obviously the case, embodied by another person. Very often, if you have an opposition, you see yourself as one side of a polarity. And that polarity can be like a tug of war, or it can be like a seesaw. Oppositions aren't necessarily bad. Squares aren't necessarily bad. It depends what you want to do. If you want to climb up something, if you want to ascend a hill, if you're walking, you want there to be friction. You can't do it in icy weather. And a trine or a sextile, much more the trine, it's like ice. It just flows along easily. That's lovely if you don't want to get anywhere, specifically upwards. For upwards movement, you need friction, and the best frictional relationship is probably the square. The quincunx also has a lot of friction within it, but it's an awkwardness to it. You don't really understand the quincunxes anything like as clearly as the oppositions and the squares. So each of these aspects has its own quality that it brings to the nature of the relationship. And so you can perhaps sort of work out that one of the planets, let's say Venus, that would tend to soften and beautify. So if Venus was aspected to Mercury, you'd have somebody who could speak beautifully or softly. And if Mars is introduced, then that would be energizing. And if the moon is involved, it's very deeply personal on the feeling level. If the sun is involved, then it's important. Jupiter tends to be supportive. Saturn tends to be restrictive. And that's not always bad, especially if you've got a gentle aspect, a soft aspect with Saturn. Then you feel the operation of restrictedness in life is quite a gentle experience. You're not thoroughly overwhelmed by restriction, whereas if you've got a Saturn square your sun, you would find yourself feeling unable to express who you are without a lot of effort. You need to put in a lot of effort to overcome a square. When you have aspects to the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, you get this sense of destiny, fate, a lot less obvious choice. You seem compelled to do things in a certain way, and that marks the track of your life rather more. So one of the things we can do is look for the outer planet connections to, let's say, the sun or the moon. Most people have such a connection. So when you're looking at the importance of an aspect, that might be the one to start with. Which of those two planets, the sun or the moon, perhaps both, has an outer planet aspect? And what is that like? So in my case, the sun square Pluto means that for me to be who I am, I need to grasp Pluto energy and really get down to the matter in hand and face the truth of it and go through process. And if I don't do that, then I tend not to feel self-expressed. Whereas somebody who has, let's say, a Moon-Neptune conjunction, they would feel highly sensitive all of the time, to the point where it might be difficult for them because they're always aware of undercurrents of emotional energy. Moon conjunct Neptune is going to be very much like a moon in Pisces, isn't it? A moon Pluto, let's take the opposition now, that very likely would give you a relationship with your mother, which is highly intense, and you would perhaps then be a woman who is intense later in life, or a man who is attracted to such women, and that might include struggles for power and dominance, or highly charged emotionality, rather like the moon in Scorpio. If Saturn is squaring Mars, you can do things, you can do amazing things, but you're going to have to work really hard to do them. The image of a camel crossing the desert with no water for days on end and a huge and heavy load comes to mind. I knew a woman with a Saturn-Mars conjunction in Taurus, and she could do anything. If it took 25 years, that's how long it's going to take. She'd do it. You know, a great deal of fortitude involved in that configuration. So all of the combinations have their own way of being. But what we're seeing in every case is that the individual planet, the planet in the sign, doesn't express in its purest form. Its energies are moderated by the aspect. And we have to really understand that before we start interpreting the planet in sign. It's no good saying, well, your sun is in Gemini, you're this, that, and the other, until you've actually seen, well, actually, they've got a square to Saturn or a trine to Neptune. You have to really take that aspect into account before you interpret the operation of the sun sign. And that's the same for all of the planets. And of course, aspects can be made to the angles as well, the ascendant, descendant, midheaven, IC, and that would moderate the application of those angles in life, and in fact the nodes as well. So aspects apply to these things. There's a lot to understand about the implication of orbs within aspects. An orb basically is the degree of error that you're going to allow while still considering the aspect to operate. So an exact angle is never the case, almost never the case. It's always a little bit out. So Mercury, Venus, 60 degrees apart, more or less, is a sextile. Well, what is that more or less? How big an orb do you allow for a sextile? Is that the same for a trine? Is that the same for a square and opposition? Well, no, it's not. They're all a little bit different, and we have to look at that. And there are as many points of view on this subject as there are commentators, how big an orb to allow. Now, I think the best image for this is just think about tuning in to a radio station. When you're exactly on the mark, the signal is clear and pure and as loud as it gets. But if you go away from it slightly, it gets a bit noisier. There's a bit of interference, and it gets a bit quieter. And you go as far as you can, and you can still hear that there's a radio broadcast, but you miss some of the words, and it's a lot of noise, and it's very quiet. Now, that's like an orb. The further away you go from accurate and exact, the more noise there is and the less signal there is. And we can also say that some of these stations are broadcasting on a strong line. So a conjunction is a really loud and clear broadcast. An opposition also, a bit less so. A square also, but significantly less so. Semi-square, very significantly less so. Trine and sextile, they've also got their measures. So let's say a rule of thumb, for me, I'm a bit tight with my orbs. I wouldn't go above 8, 10 degrees for a conjunction, a bit less for an opposition, 6 to 8 maybe. A square, I don't like going over 5 degrees, don't like that very much. A trine, probably the same. Sextile, usually 3 degrees. Semi-sextile, 1 degree. Quincunx, 1 degree, maybe 1.5 for those two. Semi-square, maybe the same, 1.5 degrees. Quintiles I like to look for, but only to the level of 1 degree, the same with septiles. The thing is that there is such a concept in astrology of harmonic charts. This is a technique where we look at, how do we say, the wrapping the chart up by a certain number of rotations. That's how you do it if you're working it out. You multiply all the planets by the harmonic and then take multiples of 360 away. That's the calculation. But let's say the fifth harmonic chart, wherein which a quintile would become a conjunction. The fifth harmonic chart would look for your creative power. The seventh harmonic chart would look for your creativity in terms of otherworldliness, mysticism and magic. The fourth harmonic is how you get things done. The third harmonic is quite a lot to do with your attunement to the more subtle spiritual questions in life. And let's say in a third harmonic chart, a trine in a normal chart would become a conjunction in a third harmonic chart. And a sextile in a normal chart would become an opposition in a third harmonic chart. And this gives a sense of the size of the orb that you might want to use. So if, for example, you're doing a third harmonic chart, then a conjunction in that third harmonic chart would operate at the level of, let's say, arbitrarily 9 degrees. So a third of that, 3 degrees, would be a totally acceptable level of an aspect in the trine, in the normal chart. And like I say, I like tight orbs. I find that tight orbs give a lot clearer message about the relative importance of the aspect. Now you can have aspect patterns. Two planets in opposition to one another, both square a third, gives a shape like that, which is called a T-square. And three planets operating in a T-square operate as a source of high-level friction. And as I said before, if you want to get the job done, you need friction. So people with T-squares, 1 or 2 T-squares, they tend to be accomplishers. They get the job done. And those people that don't really want to grasp the nettle and get on with life, they find their T-squares quite intrusive. They don't like their T-squares. But of course, having a T-square means that you want to get on with the matter in hand. You know, we're given this delightful correspondence where what we've got in our charts in the end is exactly what we want. Your own chart is the best you could possibly have. You come to that awareness in life, and you wouldn't really want anyone else's. It might look good, but it's not. Yours is the best chart you can have. So if you've got a T-square, a couple of T-squares, then get on with it. You're an accomplisher. Grand Cross, the same applies, only rather more tension, rather greater accomplishment, rather more work required, process to go through. 4 planets in a Grand Cross, quite unusual actually. Now I wouldn't use an axis within that, so I wouldn't use the nodes, north node, south node, axis against 2 planets in square to them to define a Grand Cross. That for me would be something else. Now we can look at trines in the same way. If you have 3 planets in trine to one another, you see a triangle. Well, that's called a grand trine, and this generates a lot of flowing energy. A fiery grand trine would be an incredibly active person. A watery grand trine person would be highly emotional, empathic. A grand trine would be somebody for whom things just came to them. They'd have abundance in a material world sense. Airy grand trine people, they talk a lot probably. They'd certainly think a lot, wouldn't they? Now, to turn a grand trine into a kite, one of the planets must be in opposition to a 4th planet. And a kite is rather easier to ground. The 4th planet seems to have the effect of bringing the swirling energies into focus and doing something with them, because grand trines, very often you don't see the people accomplishing very much because it's just so easy. Everything's so easy, they never bother to try. But the 4th planet, which makes it into a kite, seems to ground it and get people to do things with it. There are other ones, but those are the main ones really. You also get unaspected planets sometimes. A few people, not very many, 1 in 20 would have an unaspected planet. And these tend to operate unconsciously. Somebody doesn't really know what's going on when they operate an unaspected planet. They got no terms of reference. They can't relate to it so clearly, in my experience. And very often you'll see that lack of consciousness expresses in sort of shadowy behavior. But let's take, for example, an unaspected Jupiter in Leo would tend to behave like the negative side of a Jupiter in Aquarius. Or an unaspected Mercury in Cancer would tend to express itself like the negative side of Mercury in Capricorn. And you have this strange kind of operation. I've seen that apply, and I don't know where that idea comes from, but I've seen it does work. Now you can also have aspects to the angles. I've mentioned the aspects to the angles before, but when you've got a planet which is conjunct one of the angles, then that planet takes on very special importance in the chart. Another thing to look for quite quickly when you're doing our chart reading is which of the planets are angular. So, briefly, when I look at a chart, I look, Sun, what aspects has it got? Sign and house. Moon, what aspects has it got? Sign and house. Which planets are angular? I don't really need any more information than that, to be honest. There would be other factors that sometimes claim my attention, like stelliums, when you've got a bunch of things all together. But the first information I've given there is enough to talk for a very, very long time, long and deep about that person. And it's a very good chance that they want to talk about that material, the aspects of the sun and the moon and the angular planets. That's the primary focus that I give. What else is there to say? I think your own relationship with aspects takes a long time to develop. It's a very complex part of astrology, and it takes a certain amount of thinking, a certain amount of puzzling and studying, and a lot of experience. You'll find what orbs work for you, how sensitive you are to pick up on them, and whether this client is expressing an aspect. You'll see which is the relative importance of aspects compared to one another. Is a Sun square Mars more influential than a Moon conjunct Neptune? You know, who knows really, but you have to sort of notice in the client, somebody with a Sun square Mars aspect, they're going to look quite serious at times, you know, whereas the Moon Neptune, they're going to be dreamy and spacing out. And you have to notice whether the client is actually operating the aspect that you're talking about. And very often when you start talking about a particular aspect or particular anything in the client, they embody it. They take on the physicality of that aspect, and you notice whether they do or not. If you discuss Pluto and power and stuff with somebody, something moves into their eyes, you can see power entering their eyes if you're perceptive and you're looking for it. So aspects, highly important in astrology, and a deep and complex subject to take slowly. It takes years to learn this.